About 2 or 3 years ago, I was in a small guitar store out in Grapevine, Texas, which is a tiny community just outside of Dallas. When I was there, I had a chance to play one of Gibson's little 00 blues guitars, and I sort of fell in love with the thing. And I thought, geez, this is a really nice sounding guitar, and there's a lot of great potential with it. But when I looked at the price, I'm thinking, boy, that's a lot of money for a little guitar. So I got home and thought about it and said, well, why don't I just go ahead and build one myself? So that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years, and I'm getting to the point now where the guitar is pretty much all built. It's time to get the bridge on and get the frets in, get the nut and the strings on. But right now I'm preparing the bridge and the saddle for the back of the guitar. When I was building the guitar, I used a lot of maple ribbon to outline or to enhance a lot of the features of the guitar. And when I started building the bridge, I thought, gee, that's really kind of plain looking when you look at the rest of the guitar. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be kind of cool to put some kind of a ribbon around the holes for the pegs that hold the strings in place. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm making the little ribbon outline for the holes, and I thought I'd bring you along and let you get a chance to see how I'm doing that. Now I already have 2 of them done, and I'm working on the 3rd, and I'll take you through the process of prepping each of these holes for the plugs that I'm going to put in. The plugs themselves become the outline or the ribbon for these, and I'll show you how I do that here in a minute. Now I have 2 of them done, and I'm working on the 3rd one. The 3rd one's all installed, and now what I have to do is to drill it out to the size of the string pin that ultimately is going to go in here. So the first thing I had to do was, using a center drill, actually start that hole. And because the center drill is nice and stiff, I know that the hole itself is going to be centered to the plug itself. So I've got that done. So now I'm going to use progressively larger drills in order to get that hole to the dimension that it needs to be. Now the thing that the center drill does, it also gives a guide for the drill to follow so that the smaller drill won't begin to wander off. Now you notice I'm sort of pecking at it and not trying to drill too fast, because again, I don't want that drill to have a chance to wander off. Now there's only 2 drill sizes that I'm using for the peg holes, and this is the final drill. So that gives me the size of the hole that I need for the string pin. And if I've done this well, the size of the maple all around the circumference will be the same thickness. Because of the setup that I'm using, I can only drill 1 hole at a time. Once I've got everything lined up, I can't move the vise, I can't move the part. I drill my first hole. Everything has to stay in place so that each time I change the drill, every drill that follows the one before it is in alignment with the drill that came before it. We measured the proper location for the string spacing on this guitar, and then pre-drilled every one of those holes at 1/4 inch. And there's a reason I did that, and I'll show you that here in just a second. Pre-drilling them, I have them all in the proper alignment, and all the spacings are correct. And now, when I set this back up into the bridge port, I can then pick up each of those holes, and then using each of those holes, begin that process that I just described of doing these progressively larger drills. All right, so come on, let's do that. I built a small tapered pin, and I turned that taper on my lathe. And the reason I did that is so when I release the bridge from the vise, I can slide the bridge over, and then coming down with that tapered pin, I can just sort of shuck this around a little bit until the pin centers itself. Now, clearly, what you need to know is all that does is get me close, which is all I really care about at this point. So that tapered pin does nothing more than get me my rough alignment. Then, because I mentioned earlier that I drilled a 1/4 inch hole, I have a 1/4 inch gauge pin, and using the 1/4 inch gauge pin, I can then come down into that hole, and you can see I'm already pretty well or pretty closely aligned. But I'm not exact, so I am off a little bit, and I can see that there's a larger gap over here than there is on this side. So then using the axis wheels on the Bridgeport, I can just bring that until that alignment looks pretty good. Now again, I'm hitting over here, but I have a small gap over here, so again, just using those controls. We're talking small 1 or 2 thousandths of an inch moves that we're having to make. And now I have what looks like, or appears to be, a nice hole, or a nice even space all the way around that. And then you can see that that goes all the way down to the bottom without rubbing. And I'm also listening to hear if I can hear that pin hitting the side of the wood anywhere. Okay, so I index that pin a little bit because they don't always turn exactly true. So for this exercise, I'm going to use the term "that's close enough." Now, I need to drill this hole out so that I can get it to a size that I can put that maple plug in. But when I get ready to form this for the pins, I have to use a tapered ream to ream the hole because all these peg holes are tapered. So I know that, so I've left this size of this plug a little oversized so that when that tapered ream goes in, it's going to expand the top of that hole a little bit so that it ends up being a much thinner outline than what it looks at this moment. So the first thing I'm going to do is just oversize this hole slightly. This also gives me a chance to look, and I should see a small line where the drill is all the way around, and it is there. So we'll put in another one size larger and drill that out, and then that'll be the size of the plug. And again, the reason that I step the drill sizes up is I get less chance of the drill wandering, but it also allows for a much smoother surface on the outside of the hole, so that when I put my epoxy and glue in there, I'm going to get a much better finish when I sand or file this down. Repeating what I said earlier, now that I have that hole drilled, I can't move anything. I can't move the vise, I can't move the axis of the Bridgeport, I can't move the bridge. I have to leave everything in place. Once I have that plug installed, I need to let that epoxy set up 24 hours. Then I can come back and drill the peg holes, knowing that everything's remained in alignment. Now I can't go down to the local wood supply store and just buy a beautiful maple dowel, so I have to make my own. And specifically, I have to make it to 280 thousandths so that it has a nice slip fit down into that hole that I just drilled. I have these beautiful curly maple planks that I use for building my guitars. And I cut a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch square out of one of them, mounted that 1/2 inch square into my engine lathe, and now I'm going to turn a dowel that is as precise as I can possibly make it so that it fits down in that hole. This is an old Atlas engine lathe that I bought years ago and restored. This is a marvelous old machine. Got it to work just about as good as I possibly can at this point. I had to replace a lot of parts. Anyway, that's not so much part of the story, but it's noisy. It makes there's some gear meshing in here that you don't really expect to hear. So when I start this thing up, it will be a little bit noisy, but it does beautiful work. So come on, and I'll show you how I turn these. Now, even though this is a metal lathe and I'm turning a piece of wood, I still need to be very careful that I only take small amounts of material off at a time, because this wood is very flexible, and I have it hanging out here about 2 inches. So the concern is that if I take too much material, it's going to want to bend this, especially when I get down into that smaller dimension, when I get down to that 280 thousandths. So we can be a little more aggressive up in the early stages, but once we get really close to the final dimension or the final OD of the peg, I have to be really careful that I'm only taking small amounts of material. Let's get this started. The size that I'm looking for is 280 thousandths, and once you start to get close, you really need to be very, very careful. Right now we're at 310, 309, and on this end we're at 305, so there's about a 4 thousandths taper, which is probably this thing bending. So in order to turn this smaller, we need to turn it by half the dimension we want to make it smaller, because we're going to take obviously equal amounts off from all the surfaces all around the circumference of this. So I have to come down 25 thousandths, but I'm not going to try and get it all off at the same time. What I'm going to do is, if I come down say 5 or 6 thousandths, that takes 10. And that way I get a nice smooth surface in here. So right now the dial is at 50. We're going to bring it up to 57, 58. And by doing that, I'll take off between 14 and 15 thousandths of the 25 that I need. Okay, so we're running between 275 and 282. So that's going to be fine, because that'll leave me a little bit of space between the dowel and the hole for the epoxy to fill in and not get squeezed out. Now that I have the dowel turned, I've got to cut it off to the right length, and the thickness of the bridge is 385 thousandths. So I've set my dial calibers, the anvil, to 385 thousandths. I have a sharp pencil. I'm going to come over here and just mark that, and then spinning the jaws on the lathe and holding my pencil, and then trace that line around the entire circumference of the dowel. I have a small fretting saw, really narrow, thin blade, and then overlaying that on that pencil line, I can begin to cut that off, and using the same technique, rolling the jaws, cut around that circle, separating the plug from the main dowel. I'm going to mix up some 2-part epoxy. I don't need a whole lot of it. The epoxy is a brown epoxy, which gets me in the color range. Unfortunately, it's lighter than the surrounding wood. So what I'll do is take some black or ebony powdered pigment and add that in, turning that epoxy into a dark blackish color, which is much closer to the color of the ebony bridge. And then I'll start applying that epoxy to the outside of the plug. And then I also have enough of that epoxy left that I can come in and get some down inside the mating hole. It doesn't take a lot, it just takes a nice sort of thin coat. And from there, we'll take the plug and sort of twist it down inside as we lower it down in. The objective being to spread that epoxy. The last thing I want to do is to clean all that residue epoxy off using acetone, because the acetone will cut the epoxy, and we don't want any of that epoxy left down inside the pores because it'll be harder to get it out sanding. So there you go. So with that done, we're back to the point of beginning where we started this video. I started with the plug having the epoxy dried overnight. So from here on, I just have to repeat this 2 more times, and we'll have this thing all done. I'll bring you back when I get ready to do some more finishing on the bridge, show you how we get all that done. So thanks for watching.